Hi, I want to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 1 territory. Treaty 1 was signed in 1871 at Lower Fort Garry and includes Brandon, Portage la Prairie, Winnipeg, and more, and you can learn more at the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. Traditionally, Indigenous people will teach you through storytelling. My grandmother told me that when she was a child, in order to try to avoid sending her to residential school, that my grandfather or my great-grandfather would work for farmers in the region, and so therefore she didn't get an education. He gave up his Indian status. But what all of Canada couldn't do is avoid the impacts of what residential school and what the Indian Act has done to our nation. Over 150,000 children attended residential school from 1883 to 1996. Over 6,000 of those children died at residential school. And to give you some of that context of the children that died as a result of abuse or sickness, many of them died similar to the odds of dying in World War II. As a settlement to these survivors, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created and is making Canada more aware of this history and what some of the very important and imperative issues are to the future of Indigenous people. 1 in 7 Manitobans is Indigenous, and you're seeing this in more evident places. Keep in mind that much of that population is still under the age of 30 and still just starting their families. But none of this information is new. In 1999, I was in my first Aboriginal awareness session, and it was at that time that was predicted that starting today, the baby boomer population would start exiting the workforce, and the population that would fill that gap is the Indigenous. And so I'm calling it the Indigenous Renaissance because I've never been more excited to be an Aboriginal person in Canada, and I think what we're seeing is just the beginning. What many Canadians don't understand is that not all Indigenous people know this history. Many of us are learning about it for the first time. We don't sit around at our dinner tables and talk about this horrible past. Some of them never speak of it at all. Many people, just like myself, learn about this history and these horrible atrocities through university or other types of workshops. And that leads me to acknowledge the increasing number of university graduates. Universities across Canada are reporting the highest graduation rates of Indigenous people, and that makes me very excited because it lets me know that our future, my children and children's children's future, are in the hands of some very educated youth. And these youth, this growing population will need internships, job opportunities, on-the-job training, skill development, and access to technology. And this is something that is important. So the calls to action tell us that we need to educate ourselves, but many are still asking why. Why can't we just move forward? Why can't we just get along? Well, we are moving forward, but it's really important for us as respectful and responsible Canadians to learn that history because our education system requires that we learn Canadian history, but they left out a whole bunch of very important information. And it's up to us to act and take some learning in what that education is. And if you want to act on inclusion, I suggest that you learn that history, and when you do, you will realize that Indigenous people have always had imposed or involuntary dependency on non-Indigenous and the government. So what can you do? You can create opportunities. Opportunities to mentor and opportunities for Indigenous to mentor, because Indigenous youth will be that much more successful by being mentored by an Indigenous person. And once you invite in an Indigenous person into that workplace or environment, that person has 10 times the opportunity to bring in more Indigenous people into that workplace or environment. Drooling. Keep in mind, what are you doing in your current processes at work? So for example, if you are making it mandatory that a driver's license be something that an applicant must have, you should know that insurance programs do not work on First Nation. So right now, reconciliation is about relationship building, and sometimes that means storytelling. And for non-Indigenous, that means listening. And I know as doers that that's a really hard thing to do, but this is the time that Indigenous people need to take the lead. So what you can do is support, find a group, an individual, and support, partner, and create opportunities for Indigenous to get more involved and acknowledge the Indigenous Renaissance. Thank you. That was a quick 5 minutes.